Yeah, we're gonna head into some wild, wild country tonight. This is the last class that I'm teaching before I go on vacation, and it's been just 4 months of just like teaching, 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 and it's been amazing. It's been great, but I'm almost like I have like this much energy left. But we're gonna end tonight not with a whimper, but with a bang. Because the Mea Shiloach we're going to look at tonight is a real bang in the canon of Jewish thought, a real a dangerous thinker actually. I think I can say that there's some danger around this Torah tonight, and I should say that it is, and I very rarely say this, but it's probably not for kids. You can make that decision. Obviously, if you're a parent, but kids or people with sexual trauma, like there's stuff here that we'll go into that realm of adult conversation. Okay, so where are we? We are right. We're right after. We're on the heels of Peshischa. Last week we studied the school of Peshischa. The Rav Simcha Bonim school ended with the Kotzker Rebbe. It was the Yehudi HaKodesh, Rav Simcha Bonim and the Kotzker, and the school of Peshischa kind of blew the scene wide open. Right? It was a little unclear what Hasidus was, although it had coalesced around some founding figures. It was spreading out and then kind of like turning into, and I think worrying people, because it was turning into a kind of mass movement centered around these kind of electric gurus figures. One of which, the Chozeh of Lublin, I'm sorry, the Chozeh of, the Chozeh of Lublin, and that we'll meet another figure from Lublin, so I got confused. But was really the central Hasidic master in Europe at the end of the 18th century. And then we did this whole thing of going through Peshischa and how they left that. And a lot of what they left was that kind of like guru, it's some saint will help you get there, because a lot of what they were about was shifting Hasidus inward, right? To think about the self and the soul and what was going on inside rather than what necessarily is going on outside. So they represent that kind of turn, and also they just represent freedom in Hasidic thinking. It was no longer like you had to follow the last generation of thinkers. Sometimes you'd have a new insight and you'd need to break away. And so there is simultaneously a kind of a move away from this guru culture, which probably is, I think, my bias is that's a healthy move. And at the same time, a kind of anything's possible. Where will this thought go, right? And the Peshischa is that break, and then the first to break away from the break was the Mea Shiloach, or Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Leiner, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, and that's where he went. He went to Ishbitz, Poland. He left the Kotzker, who was in Peshischa, and he left the Kotzker. We ended on this story last time, on that Shabbat evening, right? That they speak of sort of in allusion in the tradition, where the Kotzker did something that was so disturbing that half the community abandoned him and half stayed loyal. But the wildest version of it was that he put out a candle on Shabbat and said, "There is no judge and there is no justice." Late dine, belate din. It seems almost too wild. It's like, once you hear a story like that, I wish they had Snopes back then, But still, whatever he said that night, it was enough to drive his chief disciple, Rav Mordechai Yosef, the Mea Shiloach, away, and he went to Ishbitz, and there he developed a philosophy. Right? In a way, the story's a little funny. The story makes it seem like the Ishbitzer was outraged by the Kotzker's abandonment of tradition, and yet the Ishbitzer develops a philosophy itself so controversial that they burned his books. There are incidents recorded of other Hasidim, not the Misnagdim, other Hasidim burning his books, considered them treif. And even like I heard, I've never seen it in print, but I've heard that they would refer to the book as Meshitin or Mesheten, right, which means piss, right? The word itself, or the name of the book Me HaShiloach, is it means the waters of Shiloach, and the Shiloach apparently here's I think the source. It's in Isaiah, and it's an interesting thing. Like, so Isaiah says, "Ya'an ki ma'asa amazeh et mea shiloach haholchim la'at." The people, because the Lord spoke to me thus, because that people has spurned the gently flowing waters of Siloam, of Shiloach, right? That's interesting because the language there is like the people aren't. The water is coming, the nourishment is coming, but the people are not willing to accept it. And it's also, I think, playing on other Hasidic ideas like the Baal Shem Tov apparently received a prophecy that said, like, the Messiah will come when your water overfloweth. That is when your Torah overflows. And on top of that, there's just a general Kabbalistic idea that that Shefa, God's abundance or force, flows through down from the, upper realms like water, right? And the Mei Shiloach is like, it's a river that Rashi over here, it's in Hebrew, but Rashi says, oh, in the times of David, King David, this river would flow under the temple, and it actually is nourished by a river that goes back to Eden. So you can see, this is Hasidus, like they're playing around with these kind of wild mystical ideas. And then of course, on top of that, the reason that he actually picks this name is because May, the waters, is Mem Yud for Mordechai Yosef. Okay, so that's like probably more time than you needed on the title of the book, but does give you some sense of some of the forces that he's trying to harness. Let's see. Let me give you now the source sheet that we're going to look at tonight. Okay. Let me just, sorry, I've left you in. I feel like these moments when I go silent and you're just like hovering, waiting at my screen, looking at my screen, it's like I've left you in some kind of online limbo. Here's the source sheet, okay? Before we look at it, I want to just say a couple more things. The Ishbitzer was a very important thinker. I guess in some ways by that I mean, in his own time, he had at least 3 students who were tremendous scholars in their own right. And these, these thinkers, especially the descendants of Peshischa, one of their ideas was like, you really had to, scholarship had to be deep. And they were Talmudists, right? And not necessarily as much Kabbalists as the earlier generation. So he had been this very influential teacher, but I said controversial, his books burned and all of that, and then sort of faded because he wasn't widely accepted, and the forces of orthodoxy are beginning, by which I mean the Mei Shiloach is the beginning of the 19th century. He's born in 1801. So we crossed over now. We're in kind of like the modern Hasidic movement, or Hasidus as it encounters modernity. And the Mei Shiloach is fading from kind of when he becomes so controversial, is sort of purged as orthodoxy, by which I mean to say a certain kind of nervousness about Judaism going off the rails in modernity. Orthodoxy represents this force of kind of keeping things sharp and stable. I'm sort of stuttering around a point here, but let me make it clearly. At the very outset of this, we wondered, why are the Hasidim so strict and so severe sometimes? And why do they seem like the most orthodox of the Orthodox when they were a rebellion from whatever, that wasn't called Orthodoxy, but the mainstream? And I think now we're going to start to see the pushback in modernity, where Orthodoxy starts to insist that if you're in the camp, you got to be in the camp. You got to be in the camp in all kinds of ways. And the Mea Shiloh, sort of, his thought finds itself to be outside the camp, okay? And then, last sort of word of introduction here, and then it's discovered, or rediscovered in modern times. I think that most people think that the primary person who reintroduced it was Shlomo Carlebach, which is not, that does not seem to me to be unremarkable, though I don't plan to discuss it tonight because there's just like a lot of continuing trauma and controversy in our community around whatever, like the various stories of Shlomo Carlebach. But I mention it because it's worth mentioning. Like, this is the figure who discovers the Mea Shiloh. But it's not just Shlomo Carlebach. I have this sense that I could feel even in my own schooling, there was a kind of a time when the Mea Shiloh started to become more and more popular. Suddenly started to catch on. Mimi Feigelson, who taught for a long time up at the UJ, I think I'm getting her name right, Rabbi Mimi Feigelson, taught the Mea Shiloh. She was a Chassid B'Shlomo, so maybe it makes sense, but it was a popular book. I mean, it became, and it maybe has faded a little bit, but it was popular for reasons that we'll soon see, okay? There are two distinctive features of the Mea Shiloh's thought, two important things to know. And one, we're going to see in a minute. I'm going to just hold for a second, because when you see it, it's an explosion. But let's start, and this is, sorry, it's a long introduction, but we're soon going to get to some very juicy texts. Let's start. There's two distinctive features. One of them is less of a shock, though it is the basis for it all, which is that he's known as a particularly deterministic thinker. Okay, determinism meaning the theory that the world operates according to fixed laws, and in a religious idiom, that means that God is in charge of everything. Seems like a simple enough thing to say until you realize that the consequence of that is that we don't have free will. And the Mea Shiloh is willing to say that, okay? In a way that is sourced in Hassidic thought, but he's going to say it more boldly and more sort of philosophically totalizing than anyone before. Okay, so we're going to get into it. Any questions before we dive in? Okay, my friends, here we go. This is some wild, wild Torah you're about to see right here. And I don't bring it necessarily to just sanction it and say there's something beautiful and powerful about it, and there's something dangerous, and it may feel to you very, very problematic. We'll see. Okay. So here he is, the Mea Shiloh, and he writes a really incredible commentary on the Torah. Was a scholar and had a good kind of feel for reading. And here he is finding himself in the scene where God announces to Abraham that God will visit upon Abraham and Sarah a child, and Sarah is 90 years old, will be 90 years old. And so when Abraham tells her the news, Sarah laughs. This is ridiculous. No, sorry, not when Abraham tells Sarah the news. When God had told Abraham the news, then God tells Sarah the news, and Sarah laughs and says, "What are you talking about? Abraham is so old." It's funny what she says, actually. She doesn't say I'm old. She's like, Abraham's 10 years older than me, right? Like, and it's true, Abraham's nearly 100. So, like, both of them seem not suited to the task. And she laughs, and then God says, why did she laugh? Why did Sarah laugh? God says that to Abraham. Why did Sarah laugh? And there's some great commentary work on that, right? But whatever it is, God says that, and Sarah this is the line, "V'tikachesh Sarah lemor lo tzachakti." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh." She was nervous, I guess, or that's the simplest read. But she said, "No, I didn't laugh," and God says, "Yes, you did." Okay, that's the scene. That's where we're at. Now listen to how the Mei Shiloach opens. Omek ha'inyan bazeh. This idea here is very, very deep. You gotta love some. I mean, I wish I could start my classes that way. What I'm about to teach you tonight is so freaking deep. Just get ready. I'm deep. But anyway, okay. So here the Mei Shiloach says, okay, for when it says in the Talmud, oh, little typo here, for when it says in the Talmud that everything is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven. Okay, now let me just pause right there and say that in the Talmud, everything's in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven. That is, if you were a determinist, if you wanted to say God runs the world, that's the line, and it's a famous line from the Talmud, that you would use to say, oh, God controls everything. But it's a funny line in the Talmud because it's Hakol bidei shamayim, everything, God controls everything, it's sort of poetic, everything's in the hands of heaven, but then it says, chutz miyirat shamayim, except for the fear of heaven. Now that's an important except, because it seems to mean that our consciousness is not in the hands of heaven. It may be read to mean that God controls our actions, but there's one thing that God can't control, which is whether or not we fear God, we recognize God, we see God, God can't control, because then the system doesn't make sense. There are no subjects, there's no distance from God at all. If we can't even worship God, or our worship is meaningless, unless we have we can fear God, okay? That's the statement in the Talmud. Hakol bidei shamayim, everything's in the hands of heaven, except for a certain kind of ability, a consciousness, right? Either to do differently or probably it means also, if you don't fear God, then you won't do God's will. So you actually do have free will, okay? Everything else is in the fear of heaven. But in the hands of the Mei Shiloach, it becomes something very different. Okay, wait, I just saw, oh, okay. I saw a sound issue, but it seems like it's just one person's. If there's a sound issue, let me know. Okay, in the hands of the Mei Shiloach, here we go. The idea is very deep. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven, it says in the Talmud. This is only according to the limitations of the human mind. But in truth, everything is in the hands of heaven, even the fear of heaven. It is only that in this world, the blessed God has hidden its ways. Okay. Mei Shiloach says, yeah, sure. It looks like, in this world, it seems like everything's in the hands of heaven except for the fear. But actually, God controls even that. God controls your thoughts. God controls your fear. You are in the hands of God. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Does that feel like, oh yeah, I get that. I've seen some Hassidics before that matches that impulse. Any resonance? Because we have heard a parallel idea before, in fact, one that's relatively dominant in Hasidic thought, and that is the idea of the tzimtzum, that God contracts God's self and makes it appear that there is no God, but actually everything is God. Actually, you don't really exist, surprise. In a way you exist, because God sort of wills it so that you think you exist, or something like, that was radical stuff that we encountered in the past, but that was like ontology, meaning that's a discussion of the way the existence works. This is different. This is in the spirit of the school of Shtisel. This is an account of the self, that your feelings, your consciousness, your psyche, everything that you are, you're not in control of that. That's not really, God controls that. Okay. Let me pause again, and people are being, I think, rightly timid to just jump in here because you're not sure where this is going, okay? But let me just pause there to say, like, there's something about this idea that God controls even what's inside of you that does feel like it matches a certain account of the world. Meaning, science has a kind of deterministic account of the world, which is like the forces of the world are just sort of, in the end, I think many serious scientists will tell you, you don't have any free will, because the forces of the world are all just going and following the laws of nature, right? Not God, but nature in this case. But also your feelings are just the responses of chemical firings inside of you that you don't control. So your temperament is also beyond, and sometimes it's very severe and you will need a medication, and sometimes it's just like your personality, but either way, it's chemical and it's beyond your control. I just want to point out that that's out there, and I'm not sure whether that's part of what is appealing about this thought. I'm not sure. I guess what I'm wondering is this thought appealing so far as this idea like, oh yeah, I get it. I think I'm into that. Anyone want to wager a comment? Or shall I plow ahead? Going. Rachel.
Mine is just like with determinism, which is always hard to wrap my brain around philosophically and from physics, doesn't that get rid of a need for morality? Because like, if you can't make a moral choice, then what does it matter almost? I mean, it just feels like ethics, it's wrong, but I didn't do it, you know?
Okay, the group is too smart for me. Rachel is too smart for me. Right? That's why I want to open it up, because like I can't pretend to be like the only person that knows where this is going. That's right. There are implications here, and you're about to see them. Let's just see them now that we've mentioned it, and then we'll really have like exploded the roof, and then I'll take a lot more comments, okay? So that's exactly where the Me'eshiloach goes, where Rachel went. Okay, so the defining trait of our father Isaac, right, the one who will be born to Sarah and Abraham, was such that he recognized that even the fear of heaven was in the hands of the blessed God. Now, I want to say the reason that Isaac is thought to be that person in mystical thought is very controversial itself, which is that Isaac becomes famous for being the one nearly sacrificed on the altar. And as the tradition, sort of mythology around that story grows, it often grows into a direction where Isaac willingly gave himself up to the altar and therefore represents someone who would do anything for God. Now that's not a straightforward read of the story, and also a kind of a disturbing typology, someone who would die for God. But you can see how it does fit into the Me'eshiloach's philosophy here, right? Everything is God. I'll do it. God controls. Okay? But the world was not yet ready for this precious understanding. That's the understanding of even the fear of heaven is in the hands of heaven. The world wasn't ready, and that is why Sarah had to say, and the language here is striking. It's not that she said, it's that she had to say. Right? Do you notice that? That Sarah had to say, meaning like everything's controlled. But Sarah had to say, but my master is old, right? Sarah had to deny that God could do this, because remember, one of the things that we're analyzing here is, can God create a miracle? Can God give a child to a 90-year-old and a 100-year-old? But if everything is in the hands of heaven, right, you see how all these themes are starting to come together. So Sarah had to say this in order to seem to be contradicting the idea that everything is in the hands of heaven. Like Sarah's just a device in order to clarify. Sarah denies so that because of this, the Holy Blessed One, measure for measure, would show her that even the fear of heaven is in God's hand. And that was done with the birth of Isaac, because remember, Isaac represents someone who acknowledges that God controls everything. And even if God says, it's time for you to die, that person will say, sure, you're in charge. Right? Wild stuff. But it's not, I don't really appreciate people who just spout off their ideas in the Torah and just, they don't care about the text, and Hasidus often gets accused of that. But note that he's saying something kind of cool here about the verse, because the verse is Sarah denied it. Sarah denied God's power, saying, Lo tzachakti, I didn't laugh. But remember, Yitzchak's name will be based on this laughter. So by saying Lo tzachakti, she's saying, no, I deny it. The Yitzchak force in the world is not possible. I deny that everything is in the hands of heaven, including the fear of heaven. That Yitzchak idea, that Isaac-like idea, I hereby deny that. Now, that's not how people talk, but it is kind of a cool read into the verse. Okay, I hope you see that. Okay, so basically, without this having been kept hidden until now, our father Isaac would not have been able to be born in the world. There's this process by which, and this is also quite radical, sometimes denial of God has to exist in order to clarify God's power. Like, there's a kind of a commentary on atheism here that gets drawn out by later thinkers. That, oh, atheism is good. People have to be atheistic so that the response to that can be, like, there's a give and take, a kind of a Hegelian dialectic going on in the world. And that's just, those are also part of the forces of the universe, and they produce results. For the precious trait of our father Isaac was to be able to clarify and demonstrate that even the fear of heaven is in the hands of heaven. Okay, nice little Torah, powerful Torah, radical Torah, determinism heavy Torah, free will low Torah. Great. Meir Shiloach has already told us a very, very deep thing, and then he brings you the last line. And even all the sins of Israel are under the providence of the blessed God. For through this, God's great name is enhanced and sanctified. What? I'll repeat that. Ba'af kol ha'chatoyim shel Yisrael hem b'hashgachos Hashem Yisbarach. Ki al yedei zeh yizgadol v'yizgadesh shemei rabbah. Right? That's a quote from the Kaddish. Even the sins of Israel are all just God's plan, and they somehow, in the course of time, clarify God's presence in the world. Understand this, he says, for it is very, very deep. I mean, I reread that this Shabbat and I just started laughing. Like, just toss that out there, and then you should understand this because it is very, very deep. Okay, so it's very deep. It's very deep, but it takes us to the place that Rachel was taking us, which is the place where sin is no longer sin. Sin is the will of God. And I said there are a couple of features that the Meir Shiloach is known for. One is determinism, and the other is the consequence of that. The idea that sin could be the will of God is exactly what people were afraid of with the Hasidim to begin with. That was exactly the problem. They're going to get so caught up in their divine experience that they're going to say, let's go worship in the forest. And then they're going to say, let's go worship the forest. And then they're going to say, let's go worship in the forest naked. And then they're going to say, hey, it goes on from there. This is the problem. Okay, this is dangerous Torah. But what do you think? What do you think of all that? I mean, do you think it's dangerous? Do you think it's cool? Do you think it's, messed up? Like, what do you think? Janet, you've had your hand up.
Thanks. So where does the notion of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov come into this guy's thinking?
The answer is you're also brilliantly anticipating. You're about to see that in the next piece. Okay, so I'm gonna hold it, but yes, the question Janet's asking, the idea that inside of us there's an evil inclination and a good inclination, like we're pulled in certain ways, this seems to fit. And Janet's right to ask, oh yeah, like maybe this isn't so radical. I don't know if you're saying this, but I'm adding, maybe it's not so radical after all. Like, this is a classic Jewish concept. You have these urges that pull you good to the good or to the bad. Okay, Joe?
So if this is true, then what do we need Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for? Why are we atoning then? If this is all out of our control, why are we being held accountable and judged for it?
Very good question. Very good question. I mean, the Meir Shiloach is going to have to account for this. You can't possibly be saying that there's no such thing as doing bad anymore. Yeah, okay, good question. Kathy?
Yeah, I mean, I see all those problems and I'm disturbed by those, but I just keep thinking that this is something that comes up. It seems to me similar to what Joseph tells his brothers, saying, yeah, you needed to have dumped me in the pit and tried to kill me and, and all that kind of stuff, just for this unfolding of, God's plan or whatever. And I don't know. I mean, that's all I feel like I've kind of just gone over that just because it sort of seems like just a nice thing to say to his brothers when they're trying to reconcile. But, I mean, it is the same sort of idea that these horrible things were not horrible things.
That's right. And not exactly right, Kathy. Exactly right. And not only that, what Joseph says, and actually, Jess, if you can find this, I gave a sermon about this last year, something about Joseph the theologian. If you find it and can post it, I spoke on exactly this. And what he says to his brothers is, don't worry that you sold me into slavery, right? Don't worry. The thing that you did that was the most sinful thing in your lives, don't worry. That was because it was God that brought me here, not you, right? And this plan has been in the works all along, right? That is the origins of Jewish determinism, not the Mea Shiloah, right? So great. We've got a couple of great reference points back to the past here. I think I saw someone named Uriel out there. Uriel?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I agree with just what Kathy was saying, that it's divine providence, because if we're going to sanctify God through our sins, like because we made the golden calf and then we were forgiven and that we're able to do teshuva, I think that's I don't know, that's what I got from it.
Right. I mean, we really have to go back now and think about everything. We have to think about everything. Like, did the people really have any control over their impulses in the desert? And this isn't just about saying, hey, God's up there saying, now do this and that. It's also a way of saying, like, can't we understand why people do bad things? Why did they worship the golden calf? They were afraid. They were in the desert. Moses was gone. They were freaked out. They were new to being free. I mean, there's real power to that. And I actually think, one of the things I want us to be processing as we do this is, why did he become so popular again in the modern age? And I do think one of those things is that there's a parallel philosophical trend that emerges, and in part as a kind of response to scientific determinism that says that people are not in control of what they do and their circumstances. It's not partially scientific determinism, partially it's structuralism. It's a way of talking about the way that people emerge out of cultural structures, right? And they're just part of that structure, right? Or biological structures, or right? There's something about this thought that even as it is so radical, actually, you can see why that if I start to say, well, it wasn't our fault back there at the golden calf, like that almost sounds like a modern voice, right? Like it's okay. Don't beat yourself up. There's something about that voice that tracks with this voice that we're looking at. Okay, one more comment, and then we're going to look at the real Bamba, the real bomb. Todd.
Aside from the philosophical underpinnings that he's pointing out, is there any kind of socio-political context to this, in that you have these various sects of Hasidism vying for attention? Was there any ulterior motive here, perhaps to lower the bar, to create a more accessible Judaism that allowed people who saw themselves as sinners and unworthy to actually say, you know what, I am a creature of God. What I did may be not perfect, but that's still part of God's doing. Therefore, this is a movement that speaks to me. I mean, is there any sort of recruiting methodology that was going on here as well?
I certainly can't speak to that with any kind of authority. I get what you're saying, and it sounds right to me, at least in one very basic way, which is that we've seen that too in Hasidus. We've seen this idea that the people should be forgiven for their sins, and let's not hold the people of Israel accountable. We saw it mostly in the Kedushat Levi, But let me just say that the difference here, and so Todd is right, and so it may be that there's a kind of a Hasidic impulse to just let the people be and not hold them to such account. But what I want to say is that the difference is that the Kedushat Levi, of all the Hasidic thinkers, is most known for his Avas Yisrael, his love of the people of Israel. Whereas the Meshiloach is saying similar things, but not motivated by his love for the people, but motivated by his Yira Shamayim, his fear of God. And there's a different emphasis here. It's not so much, though he will end up permitting things that are crazy, it's not so much that he seems to have compassion so much as that he thinks it's important that you recognize that God is in control of everything. Now, his psychological motivations or his sociological motivations, I don't really know, and we can continue to speculate, but I think you'll see that there's a kind of it's all born of a kind of a sense of God's totalizing presence and the kind of the total recognition that you have to have of that. Yitzchak, in his thought you just saw, is valorized for realizing that nothing is not God. And even the fear I feel of God is just a product of God. A language of the fear I feel of God. Okay? All right. So now, oh, wow. Speaking of dangerous Torah, I mean, this piece is infamous. If someone knows about the Meshiloach, they teach you the Torah from Parshas Pinchas, from last week's Parsha. I almost timed this right. From last week's Parsha. So Parshas Pinchas, it begins and is called Pinchas because Pinchas, the son of the high priest, is being rewarded and honored by God for having murdered two people. I use that word because it sort of seems like a murder, but it's a response to these two people, Cosby and Zimri, who were, it's not clear what they were doing, but the sort of insinuation of the text and the classic midrashic reading is that they were having sex, they were like, or at least parading their union, which was a forbidden union because she was a Midianite and he was one of the tribal leaders of Israel. Okay, so what happens is, just to back up one more step, there's a scene in the Torah in last week's Parsha where it says that, or 2 weeks ago actually, because Pinchas is the one after that it says like, and the children of Israel were, basically it says, whoring themselves to the daughters of Moab. And then also it seems the daughters of Midian, and then like they're stressing out about what to do. And then one of the tribal leaders brings a Midianite woman up to the tent of meeting where God comes to Moses. And, it may be understood, and then they proceed to copulate right there in the sort of altar. And everybody's shocked, and it says everybody's weeping. Who knows what to do? And Pinchas just takes a sword and jumps up and kills them both. Now, you can kind of understand in the context of the story why Pinchas would, but it's certainly an example of religious zealousness, religious violence. But Pinchas is rewarded. So we are to understand, and all the tradition understands, that Pinchas did a good thing, but the Meshiloach does not agree. So let's take a look. Okay. And Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw Zimri and Cosby, and he took a spear in his hand and stabbed them both through the belly. Okay. Now listen to the way the Meshiloach starts. Speaking of suspicious Torah, right? Torah that doesn't seem grounded enough in the text. This, I think, is problematic. He says, it should not arise in your mind. God forbid, chas v'shalom. Chas v'shalom. It should not arise in your mind that Zimri was an adulterer. Chas v'shalom. What do you mean? Zimri had a wife and then he went off and cheated on his wife with the Midianites? Don't think that that's possible, for the Holy Blessed One would not make a whole section of the Torah out of an adulterer. Now, come on. I mean, come on. What kind of logic is that? Like, oh, this wasn't a sin. God wouldn't write a whole part of the Torah about a sinner. It's like, what? Pharaoh's in the Torah. Like, what are you talking about? Doesn't like, you feel like this is just a leverage point. Like, he just wants to get in there and say something. But I have to say, like, why does he want to say it here? Why is it important for him to, as he's soon going to do, defend Zimri and Cosby? Okay, so let's see. He says, shouldn't have right. No way, God wouldn't, adulterer must be, rather there is a hidden mystery in this matter. Oh good, there's a hidden mystery in this matter. Okay, and here now he's going to present us with a system that became absolutely infamous. And I'm not sure he intended for this to be his central Torah, but this is the one that everybody knows, okay? For there are 10 levels of lust. There are 10 levels of, and I'm not sure lust is the right translation. The word in Hebrew is, maybe later, the word in Hebrew is znut, right? Znut is like sexual, I don't know, whoring, like sexual lust. There are 10 levels of lust. I think lust actually fits best in this context. Okay, so what are the 10 levels and how do you know that? But the first level is one who dresses themselves up and deliberately goes out for sinful purposes. Okay, that's level one. I'm like, oh, I'm going out tonight and I'm going to sin. Right? I'm getting all gussied up to sin. Okay, so this person is drawing the evil urge upon himself. Now here's Janet's connection, right? What about the Yetzer Hara? This evil impulse that you have inside of you that seemingly, if it's an impulse, you can't control. Well, he's saying, yeah, but there is a level where there is a level here where you're actually kind of indulging in it. Like you're bringing the impulse out. And in this case, it's a sexual impulse, right? It's lust. You're like, oh, I want to, tonight's the night, right? I'm going for it. Who cares? I'm going to psych myself up for it. So you did this on purpose. You did this on purpose, okay? And this begins also to speak a little bit to Joe's question, like, what does it mean? Like, don't we have control over anything we do? Well, yeah, we do. We have control over some of the things we do, right? Where does Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur fit in? Well, certainly this guy's got to atone on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But after this are another 9 levels. And at each level, a person loses, ooh, some typos there. A person loses some of their free will. I shouldn't do this in real time, but I get so annoyed with typos. Some of the free will, I've never, like, speaking of temptation, I've never had the opportunity to correct typos in real time. And it's like, I'm at the 10th level. Like I have to do it. Okay. So a person loses some of their free will at each one of these levels. And I'm not sure, if there are really 10. It may be just a way of saying there are increasing levels of lust. And at a certain point, it becomes less and less possible for them to resist the sin. Dangerous Torah, until they get to the 10th level, where someone has completely distanced themselves from the Yetzer Hara and guarded themselves from the sin with all their power. They really tried. No, they're working on it. They would not give in. They're struggling as hard as they can, so much so that it would be beyond their capacity to guard themselves any more than they already have. They're trying as hard as they possibly can. And then when their desire overpowers them and they commit the act, at that point, they know for certain that their actions are the will of the blessed God, of Hashem Yisbarach. Okay. Okay. I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is this helpful? There's one way to read this, that this is quite helpful. Like he's understanding what it's like to struggle with our urges. And so surely sexual urges are chief among them. It might be different for different people. Maybe yours are anger or eating or whatever your urge is, money. But it is interesting that his focus here is on sex. Let me add one more thing, and then I want to hear whether you think this is helpful or dangerous. Okay? I'm going to add one more piece here, which is this. He has another example. And it's Yehuda and Tamar. This was the case of Yehuda and Tamar. Now, the story of Yehuda and Tamar, very quickly, is that Tamar married Yehuda's son. The son was evil for some reason and died. Tamar then married the second son. That son seemed to also be evil and died. Then Judah or Yehuda got nervous and basically locked Tamar away, kept her hostage. Like really not the right thing to do. And she snuck out, disguised herself as a prostitute. So here we are in the realm of Znut again. And Yehuda solicited that prostitute, and Tamar became pregnant by Yehuda. Now, all of this is disgusting and gross and cruel and terrible. But, says the Meshilach, she was actually his soulmate. She was actually supposed to be with Judah. And it's the same case here, for Zimri was truly guarding himself from all evil temptation, yet the thought arose in his mind that she, Cosby, was his soulmate, since it was not within his power to refrain from this deed. So you see the kind of the case he's building here? It's like there are these certain examples of these very holy people who seem to have done terrible things because they were driven by lust. And you just have to understand, like, there were higher forces at play. Now, that's different. That's different, saying like, humans are humans. Now he's inserting some God into it and saying, no, God, actually, sometimes God wants it to happen. And your lust is the vehicle that God uses to manifest God's will. Dangerous or useful? What do you think? What do you think of all this? Joe, what do you think?
I'm going to go with dangerous on this one, because I think, again, if we take the context of Hasidism aimed not at like super whoop-de-doo Torah scholars and Talmud scholars, but everyday ordinary people who are not necessarily thinking on these high levels, I don't know that they're going to be people who are going to be thinking in terms of all these 10 levels of lust. And when you're embroiled in a situation like that, you're going to be able to really fight it all the way and with all your might. And then you get to that level where you just couldn't, despite your best efforts, and you sinned anyway. And you're going to say, well, it must have been God's will. It seems like an easy out.
Okay, I love that. That's a great rejoinder, which is, in different words, it's like, I mean, this is an interesting spiritual exercise. And maybe if you're working really hard on it, you can like use this system. But to think that that's what we need to be doing is, and Zimri just did that in that example. Zimri's like, boy, I've tried as hard as I can and it doesn't seem like I can resist. So I guess this is the will of God. I mean, if we were all allowed that excuse, I mean, goodness, things get pretty justifiable pretty quickly. Okay, what do other people think? Anyone else? Dangerous, useful, understandable? You have some insight into it? Yeah, Tali.
Yes, it's Tali here. I think it's two different situations. I look at I think when I look at with the story with Yehuda and Tamar, right? She was really she protected herself. She was very, very clever, and I think Yehuda really had to do a teshuvah process and he came forth and said, wait a second, when he saw the ring, no, don't blame her. It was me. He was taking a sense of responsibility. So I'm wondering if what we're showing here is a different either lesson where there was both less, but I think one, when I keep on looking at the Pinchas story and his zealotry, and the zealotry in somehow was awarded with this covenant of peace, I'm wondering that if really, when we're following after that, if that covenant of peace was given in a way and saying this was zealotry, but wanted to show him that God was showing even within this peace, that maybe he didn't totally agree and gave him the peace, say that you have to handle things peacefully and not as aggressively as he was.
Okay. No, this is perfect. Tali, you're saying so many brilliant things. This is perfect. First of all, I think you're right that, okay, the other example, the Judah and Tamar story, I mean, on the one hand, how could you justify what Judah's done? But on the other hand, first of all, there is a kind of a reconciliation at the end of that story. And Judah doesn't keep sleeping with Tamar. Judah eventually realizes that he's done wrong both by.
Right.
So there's a tshuva process, but not only that, let me just add to that Judah is not just a hero in the book of Genesis, but Judah is thought to be the progenitor to the Messiah. Judah is certainly, the house of David is Judah, right? And by the way, the house of David also comes about through Ruth, who is a Moabite. That's a forbidden union, and the Talmud has to kind of take care of that. In other words, there are some other things going on here that are like a mystical thinker is seeing, and I don't think it takes a mystical thinker to see this, that there's a certain theme in the Bible where things sexually that seem like they're not supposed to happen end up actually being the right thing because the right kind of people come out of the, in a kind of larger historical sense. And now we begin to see some sense of God controlling over this all, right? Okay, but when we look at the story of Zimri and Cosby, it seems so strange that the Mea Shiloach Zimri's not a figure you care to valorize. And Pinchas gets all of these accolades. So how does the Mea Shiloach deal with that? Pinchas, as Atali also said, is given by God the covenant of peace. It's what? Okay, so let's take a look. The Mea Shiloach turns here and starts attacking Pinchas. And here too, I think we can begin to, in other words, the person who sees the sin, and in this case, the sexual indiscretion, and attacks it, who is that person? And the Mea Shiloach here is both dangerous and also, I think, very insightful in certain ways. So let's take a look. The Mea Shiloach finishes by saying, now, Pinchas, right, all of this stuff we said, Zimri, actually it was his soulmate. Yehuda actually is his soulmate. But Pinchas said the opposite. That Zimri still had the strength to refrain from this. In other words, Pinchas thought that Zimri was on level 9. You could do it. And so it's a sin that you indulge. You had more power, right? In other words, this becomes two people, one, the sinner saying, I couldn't control it, and the other, the attacker saying, you could have, or not the punisher, let's say, okay? The Talmud, he says, hints at this, because the Talmud says, well, 6 miracles were performed for Pinchas. What are the miracles that were performed for Pinchas? The Talmud says over there that if Zimri had gotten up and killed Pinchas, then Zimri would not have been punished. Now that's true. The Talmud does say that, and the Talmud says that as a way of saying, wait a minute, this isn't how justice works. You can't just think someone sinned and then stab them in the belly. The Talmud, in other words, asks the question, wait a minute, how can Pinchas do this? Tali was asking that question, the Mea Shiloach is asking this question. So the Talmud says, if Zimri had defended himself, Zimri would have gotten off, because you can't just attack someone because you think they're sinning. Because, he continues, this was truly a case of reasonable doubt, after all, and there was surely room to make a legal case against Pinchas. Pinchas did wrong here, but because it certainly appears to the observer that Pinchas acted out of rage. Pinchas didn't bring justice. Pinchas was just incensed, outraged, disgusted. Now, what does he say about that? Now, remember, this is a guy who's working with Kabbalistic ideas. And by the way, that's also new, right? He had come from a school where they had basically purged Kabbalistic ideas. You can see them seeping back in. And he says, now Pinchas came from the seed of Joseph. That's in the writings of the Arizal, who had trials and sufferings in this realm. Now that's because Joseph is known as Yosef HaTzadik, the righteous Joseph, but Joseph is called that because Joseph was in the house of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. And the rabbis don't say, and Joseph proudly stood up and said, no way. The rabbis, interestingly, say, Joseph was very tempted. There was a real desire there. and Joseph restrained himself. Joseph was righteous because he pushed against that urge and somehow managed to get away. Somehow managed to stop himself. It's an interesting characterization of Joseph, okay? But what does the Meshilach make of it? Now, Pinchas had come from the seed of Joseph, who had trials and sufferings in this realm. What realm? The realm of controlling his sexuality. And therefore, Zimri's deeds seemed particularly evil to Pinchas. And I think that's really interesting. Pinchas, he's saying, was particularly outraged by sexual sin because he had it in him, or his family had it in them. He was outraged because he saw something there that he worried about in himself, or at least that he felt like, you have to fight harder, you have to suffer, you have to control it. But the foundational depths of the matter were hidden from Pinchas, namely that she, Cosby, had been ordained as Zimri's soulmate from the 6 days of creation, as it's explained in the writings of the Arizal. Here he's quoting the great Kabbalist, the Arizal. This is actually, he was wrong. Zimri was supposed to be his soulmate. He was wrong. This is as explicit as he's saying it. Pinchas was wrong. Zimri was supposed to be with this Midianite woman, but Pinchas made a mistake. And so Moshe Rabbeinu did not attempt to judge him for capital punishment, which is, there's a typo there too, which is a way of saying that Pinchas should have been tried for what he did. Pinchas shouldn't have just acted of his own volition. We find that Pinchas acted as a foolish youth because he did not understand the depths of the issue and only saw through perception of human intellect and no more. And then I gotta say, this is like, nevertheless, Hashem Yisbarach loved him and gave him approval because, according to what Pinchas' understanding, he had done a great thing out of zealousness and put his life in danger. That feels to me like a throwaway, like, oh well, what do I do with the fact that God approved of this? Well, God was nice to him anyway. That feels to me like, I don't buy that. But what I do buy is this end where he's saying Pinchas didn't get it. Pinchas didn't understand that sometimes things which seem to be sexual transgressions actually need to happen. Sometimes humans can't see that, but from God's perspective, sometimes that needs to happen. Now, I ask you one last time tonight, dangerous or helpful? And I'll admit here, I find some of this helpful. Like the idea that Pinchas was so outraged and so needed to stop this sexual sin because of something that he just didn't get and that he was actually maybe even worried about inside himself. I want to be careful saying, oh, the Meir Shiloh was right after all. There are pieces of this that I found profoundly insightful and useful. And then there are other pieces that feel like, oh my God, where does this go? What do we start justifying here? So I don't know. What do you think? Uriel, you got another thought?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like his take on it. Because I think that Pinchas was courageous and doing something that was bold, and I don't think he was doing it out of anger, but out of righteousness. And didn't it stay a plague by doing that? Yeah. Pinchas's actions do seem to stop the plague. This is really a counter to the simple reading. I think you're right, Uriel. What's funny about it is that I pointed out in the first piece we read that he had a very kind of playful, cool read on the verses, right? And I, as a Torah guy, I feel like, just give me your reading of the verses and I'll take anything. But this seems like what's called a dochek. He's shoving it in there and it doesn't belong there. Make the point elsewhere, right? Make the point of the fact that Moses married a Midianite woman. But that seems like something to justify. Judah, okay. But this doesn't, it just seems like he wants to say it. Janet.
I'm thinking that this guy is trying to teach us that humans are different. And we should learn that there are different responses to different situations and we all would respond the same way. And I think he's pulling out different threads and that's why it feels like he dumped it in here. But he's trying to give us a view of humans.
Yeah. I think that there's a real depth to what you're saying, Janet. And again, I want to remind you that I think all kinds of kind of modern liberal types became obsessed with the Meshilot. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing there, but I just saw it in my circles. And I think part of it is like, there's a version of this Torah that says, like, don't judge people's sexuality. And don't use your like, oh, but the law says this. It's like, we're weak creatures. We're subject to all kinds of impulses. It's just who we are. Like, and God made us this way, right? And you could take that in lots of different ways. And I don't mean to. I'm not going to say, oh, this is like read this into gay rights or something. Like, that's not what I'm doing, because it's too dangerous to say like, oh, let's just import this system over. But there are just streaks, elements of this that are somewhat liberating or tolerant or understanding. Like that is, it's part of the messy picture here. Let's see. I want to make sure if anyone has not spoken yet, I want to make sure that you have a chance. So feel free to raise your hand. Bob?
Yes. So the whole evening, as I'm hearing this, and and trying to put together the pieces, and why he was considered so outlandish and dangerous, and hearkening back to one of the first things you said, Rabbi, which was way back in one of our earlier classes, that part of the whole Hassidic movement was bringing this to the masses and the people who were not necessarily just the most studious and could understand these additional depths. So, I keep on thinking that, maybe the reaction against this, to your point, this wasn't, sexual freedom and gay liberation, but it was maybe like too much for people, that there was this sort of allowance of the complexity of humans, and it was just, especially because it was geared towards the masses, it was just too much for them to take, and that was the reaction against it.
Yeah, that sounds very, very wise to me. And that seems like a fairly, for all the difficulty in categorizing the Meshilot, the response to him, at least the book burning response, I think Bob gives a description that I would buy, which is that it's just like, you just toss this out there. Like, there's something about this just like, whoa, but the generous reading of it is that he understands that sexuality is really complex. And so people are like, well, don't say that though in the public, because we have religious rules. You can't just start telling people like, well, there's something about that that's true, even though, his contemporaries and even our contemporaries are kind of worried about where this go. I mean, I saw someone who is in the chat said, what about like a rapist, for example, saying I can't control myself? Absolutely right. I mean, that is about as dangerous as this Torah can get. I mean, where does this lead? It's not so easy to say, oh, good, we're all excused for our sexual impulses. Like, careful, where does this go? Lauren?
I guess for me, the part that was so interesting is this idea that maybe Pinchas saw something in himself that he was projecting, right? Because it does feel to me like judge not, right? Lest ye be judged. Like, and the idea that only God really knows. So it's not so much excusing all behavior, it's that God is the one that gets to judge the behavior. Because on some level, if he's projecting and saying, no, this is bad, and then the Torah says, well, maybe not. Maybe this is exactly what was supposed to happen, and you're not the one to say what's supposed to happen and what's not. That to a certain degree, that's where the flexibility lies. Like, because I know for myself, I had a moment where I literally, I don't want to get too specific because I don't know any of you, but there are moments in my life where I have felt like there was a thought that came to me that didn't make any sense. And that's how I knew that it was God, because I would have chosen something else. So this idea of, oh my God, I tried so hard and it happened anyway, isn't necessarily saying you get permission to do whatever you want, but when you really are committed to making a righteous choice and then something else seems to interfere, that does seem like proof that God exists, because if I could have chosen differently, I would have.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing in that very appropriate way. You know, that thought that I think like is probably familiar to a lot of us. Like, whoa, why is my mind going there? And maybe it's just my mind, you know, and maybe it's God actually, you know, like is one way to put that.
Yeah, and I'm not, by the way, just to be clear, I'm not talking necessarily just about a sexual issue, just like in general. Yeah, just to be clear.
Yeah, neither am I. Yeah. But I also think that is part of what your insight there is very profound. That the deterministic worldview is dangerous in some ways because it implicates a release from responsibility. That's what it means to say, like, what about sinning? We go, what about Rosh Hashanah? But it's value. Like, why even go there? Like, theologically, I get, oh, God's in control. But what about ethically? What does it do for you? And I think Lauren's right that there's in a deterministic world, like, nobody is to be judged. Now, of course, that's dangerous. But there's something appealing about living in a world without judgment, where we all, like, nobody's like the villain, and nobody's doing bad. Like, everybody's just a product of their circumstances trying their best. But now, of course, the Meshilach said, well, but, you know, trying your best is like 9 levels. Like, seems like you should be spending a lot of this time actually working on trying these 9 levels, right? Not just saying, it's too easy to say, oh, yep, so it was the 10th level again. Guess you know. Okay. Okay, so let's just look at the time. Okay, and on that note, the Meshilach gives us these 10 levels, but does seem to kind of give Zimri the pass. See, this is like Zimri actually was on that 10th level. I mean, what could be more 10th level than this person was designated to you from the days of creation? So Pinchas gives Zimri the Mehashiloach gives Zimri a pass, which is very counterintuitive, and criticizes Pinchas, which is sort of odd to the textual reading. Okay, and so we're left feeling like the Mehashiloach he just wants to say this. Like that the Mehashiloach, in other words, is trying to be dangerous. Like his thought contains this depth and this complexity, and it can be mined for things that are very valuable, but it almost seems like he's going for it. And when someone's going for it like that, especially around issues of sexuality, you have to just like wonder, wait, what's driving this? You know, like what's your issue exactly? Now, with that in mind, I just want one last piece of text, and a short one, from one of him. I said he had 3 chief students, and the one that has become the most famous is Rav Tzaddik Cohen of Lublin. Rav Tzaddik Cohen was not a Chassid, spent most of his life as a Talmudic scholar in the kind of non-Hasidic world, and then came to Ishbitz one day. And I must say, like, he represents a kind of like unusual amount of Talmudic scholarship. Like, it's sort of hard to read his writing because he just quotes one passage after another of the Talmud. He's like really brought the full scholarship of that world into Hasidic thought. But here, he wrote also books of philosophy, and here I just want to end with something that he said on our topic. All right, so this is Rav Tzaddik Cohen of Lublin, Poland. So I got confused earlier as a Lubliner. Okay, so Rav Tzaddik Cohen says, sometimes the person stands before a great trial, so severe that it is impossible that he not sin. So severe that it's impossible that he not sin. All right, that, as is taught in Talmud Brachot, what could the son do? Oh, let's see if we can click over to Talmud Brachot. This is actually worth seeing. Let's see if I can get it very quickly. This is great, by the way, I gotta say, being able to do this in real time in a class. I mean, it's just like, it's been such a gift to me as a teacher. Okay, so where is it? I think I spoke too soon because I don't have the, where's the, oh, here it is. This is the text he's using. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, Rabbi Yochanan said, this is comparable to a person who had a son. He bathed him and anointed him with oil, fed him and gave him a drink, and hung a purse of money around his neck. Then he brought his son to the entrance of a brothel. What could the son do to avoid sinning? It's kind of, it's like, you know, these guys are playing with these very weird stories. But again, you kind of get it. Like, what could the son do? Right? And that is considered duress, he said, for which the merciful one excuses a person. Okay, that's more wild, dangerous Torah. We've seen that before. And those are the teachings of his master. But then look at how he ends the piece. It's interesting. One last line, and actually it's two last lines. The last line is, and we haven't heard this yet, but we should have heard it. But a person cannot accurately assess themselves in this because perhaps they still do have the strength to overpower their desire. Finally, someone says, okay, yeah, all of this is true, and sometimes God controls it, and we're just at the subject of our impulses, but you can't decide when it's no longer in your control. Like, you have these intuitions, but like, it's dangerous to start walking around and saying, no, I couldn't help myself. So that's a little bit of a, like, oh, did Meir Shiloach never said that? It's like, so glad someone said it. But then he says one more thing, one last thing. And this is interesting. I want to end on this. He says, and the editor of the book says, the words in brackets he added afterwards. And this is like what I heard about this matter in the episode of Zimri, right? That sounds right. Meir Shiloach just taught us that. He was the chief student of the Meir Shiloach. This is what I heard about this, that he made a mistake in this. What? That's a twist. He's saying differently. He's saying, I heard about how this works and everything, and by the way, I heard about this discussed in the case of Zimri, and, Zimri made a mistake. Zimri screwed up. In other words, like, I disagree with my teacher. That reading might have gone a little too far. Remember, he's just said, person can't decide for themselves. Like my teacher, he's my teacher, and I admit to this philosophy, but like, whoa, let's be careful. Let's be careful. And I must say, and this is I'm going to end with my own Hassidic reading of a text, which is that I think he's saying more. I think that when he says that I heard about this in the matter of Zimri, that he made a mistake in this, and it reads like Zimri made a mistake. But I think he's saying that my master made a mistake about this one. I think it's a little bit of the Meir Shiloach is brilliant and insightful, and and I admit to what he said. He knows what is true about the world, but like, you have to be careful about using this. And you have to even be careful about how you read it into the Torah, because I remember when my master used to talk about this, and I don't think he read it right. Okay, so that's our time, and I want to just end on that because I think it speaks to this moment in Hasidic thought, which is that like the doors have been busted wide open, and anything now it feels like can happen, and that's part of what's so exciting about Hasidic thought, and that's part of what's so exciting about the Meir Shiloach. But when you are taking those kinds of spiritual risks, when you are that spiritually daring, you can make mistakes, and it can be very dangerous. And Hasidic teachings have to be, taken with a note of caution, right? Because it's hard to know where exactly this goes, and it can go to dangerous places. That's one thing that the critics of the Meir Shiloach were probably right about. So I'll end on that note. Folks, I have loved doing this with you. This is the class that's taken the most of my time to prepare for, and it's been such a labor of love. It's just every week I'm like deep in one book. And it's been like, it's always the teacher that learns the most. I've learned so much about the journey of Hasidic thought from its inception. And I hope you have learned a lot too, and I hope you've seen a lot. And I don't want to stop teaching Hasidus, but I do, and actually I think probably we'll have to finish this work off a little bit. We have a couple of other major thinkers to look at in the modern period, particularly Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, particularly the Lubavitcher Rebbe, particularly the Satmar Rav. Some of those people I'd like to bring in other experts to talk about, but we are going to go on break, not just for the next 2 weeks, but also for the whole month of August and September, the high holidays. because we're going to shift our focus. And when I come back in August on Tuesday nights, I'll be teaching earlier. I think this has been a late hour for many. So I think we're going to back it up a little bit and teach earlier some of the laws of tshuva, Maimonides, very non-Hasidic stuff for the month of August, right? And then we'll come back after the high holidays and we'll reconvene and start to think about like what Hasidic thinker we could spend a little more time with. So that's my plan. But it's been really a joy, and it's been spiritually sustaining for me as well, I have to say. This stuff, this material, it's wild, and I don't sign on to all of it, but it also is in some ways the most spiritually potent material that modern Judaism has to offer. And I have heard so many people say to me over the course of this, like, I didn't realize this was out there. I didn't realize Judaism was this spiritual, right? So if nothing else, like Hasidus deserves and has been awarded acceptance into the canon for bringing that spirit, that sort of yearning, that real desire for a deep spiritual life back into the Jewish conversation. I hope that has been brought also into our community's conversation. Okay, that's enough out of me. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rabbi Kasher.
Bye, all. Bye.
Have a great vacation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks. I'm looking forward to it. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Good night.